it becomes a minor miracle in a way that anyone uses these things, given the level of inconvenience thrown at you as a user.
Welcome to Calling All Stations, the transport podcast. I'm Christian Wommer, an author and journalist who has covered transport for the past 30 years. In every episode, we try to keep you up to date with the most engaging news stories, policy developments, and interviews in the transport world. And with me is my regular co-presenter, Mark Walker, who has spent decades looking at transport policies and legislation. So, Mark, what are we covering today?
Hello, Christian, and hello to our listeners. We'll be looking later on in this episode at the reform programme for railways in Great Britain, which has taken a big step forward this week. And also we have an interview with Richard Dilks, who is the Chief Executive of CoMoUK, which is the organisation for shared transport, promoting the social and economic and environmental benefits of things like car sharing, bike sharing, and e-scooter sharing. But before we go into any of that, we should update our listeners on where you are in the world this week, because a few weeks ago we were big in Japan, or rather you were, while I was still here in Peterborough in the UK. But where are you in the world today, Christian?
Well, I'm afraid I'm in the same direction, but not quite as far. I'm in India. And indeed, to be specific, I'm in Darjeeling. And I'm sure that certainly the train buffs amongst our listeners will know that I'm bound to have been on the Darjeeling Himalayan Railway, which I must confess I didn't get all the way up the hill with it, but because it is very slow. It takes about 7 or 8 hours to cover some 60 or 70 miles from the valley bottom up to 7,000 feet at Goom, and then it goes slightly down a bit to reach Darjeeling, where we're at 6,000 feet. So I'm in India to actually give lectures on a luxury train run by a company called Golden Eagle, and I'm going to give a series of lectures. But in the meantime, I stopped off at Kolkata, where I flew to. And I must say, Kolkata is a fairly depressing place because I was first there about 20 years ago. And it doesn't seem to have changed in the way that lots of other Indian cities have changed and kind of improved and, cleaned up a bit. And, you see kind of lots more signs of new types of activity, notably tech. Whereas in Calcutta, they actually seem to have not moved forward at all, and it's still pretty grubby and millions of people. And what's really depressing is that it's the last place in India that had heritage trams, and they managed to survive right through to the last time I was here, where they were still running relatively regular services. And there's actually rails down the middle of lots and lots of streets. So there's, it shows that the network was there. But we went on a chartered tram ride because the normal services aren't kind of running. And I just saw an article in the Times of India which said, the police are very anxious to get rid of all the trams, these heritage trams, which of course would be a wonderful tourist attraction if they were even slightly revamped, and would be a wonderful, actually, transport innovation if they were done up in the same way that, countries around the world and cities around the world are doing up their trams, starting services that were long been abandoned and so on. And, there's several hundred cities in the world with tram systems, and yet Calcutta is about apparently to abolish even its heritage trams because the police don't like it and there's no money to revamp them and so on. So that's, to be honest, rather depressing. But it's always great to be in India. It's such a lively, vibrant place. And I must say the Darjeeling Himalayan Railway isn't in a great state either. The train I was on derailed. It doesn't, not very dramatic. They derail the whole time. and they derail. It's not like it ends up with a locomotive lying on its side. It's just one of the carriage wheels comes off and they go and get a jack and jack it back on again. I mean, this is narrow gauge, remember, very narrow gauge, and it runs next to the road a lot of the time and goes over the road about 100 times, and it's particularly on those bits where the rails get damaged and the trains comes off the rail. But there's only a few trains a day. It doesn't really serve the local people anymore. Even when I was here 20 years ago, it did actually run something of a service for local people, but now it's really only tourists who go on it. And it's in a pretty poor state. There are some steam engines still. The one that hauled me was originally built in 1881, apparently, and it's been redone a few times. But so it's still a great experience. But one does wish that they would actually do it up a bit and make it kind of a bit more viable, because again it looks as if it's a UNESCO heritage site. Otherwise I think they would let it die, which would be a great shame. So slightly depressing story from India, but I'm soon tomorrow going to go on the main lines where numbers are booming, freight is booming, there's lots of investment, there's even a high-speed line being built, there's a metro system that is under construction in Mumbai, which I'm going to go see. So there'll be lots of positive things to report on, maybe in the next podcast.
Yes, I think we should pick this up in the next episode, because many of the stereotypical views that we have of Indian railways, I dare say, are outdated in the same way as they were when you reported from Japan on how things have changed. So I'm sure we'll pick this up in the next episode with other aspects of your travels.
Absolutely, and I'll have lots more information then too. So that's for the next episode. But Mark, you're of course still in Blighty, and inevitably, whenever I leave the country, there's always a big rail story, whether it's an accident or whether it's some policy change or whether it's some big announcement or whatever. There's always a railway story. There might not be a railway story for months, but you can be guaranteed that when I go away, there'll be a railway story. So it's rather a big one at the moment, isn't it, that you've kept your eye on, the publication of the consultation document on Great British Railways. So what's it like, Mark?
Well, yes, Christian. So yes, you picked a good time to be out of the country, as you say. So the loyal listeners will recall that in the King's speech last summer, when the newly elected UK government announced its legislative programme, it saw the reform of the railways taking place in two legislative bites. So the first bite was to enact as quickly as possible, in fact at extraordinary speed, the Passenger Railway Services Public Ownership Act, which allows the government to return what we used to know as franchised rail operations that have been in place for the last 30 years back into public ownership. They then promised a second parliamentary bill which would establish a unified directing mind for the railways, to be called Great British Railways, picking up a term, of course, that the previous Conservative government had initially forged. And this was to be to require a second, as I say, parliamentary bill, but also to require a consultation beforehand. And what we saw published earlier this week was that consultation document, which is given the title A Railway Fit for Britain's Future.
Yeah, I've seen it's 52 pages long, Mark, so we're not going to go through the whole of it, but so
mercifully not. No.
It's pretty dull. It's lots of verbiage. I managed to read it from India, but it's pretty padded out. So what's the core messages in it?
So I suppose what you will see as a sort of overview is, in certain respects, it's remarkably similar to the consultation that the Conservatives undertook roughly a year ago when they were leading up to legislating for their own version of Great British Railways. So some of the areas in which it's remarkably similar are in the role that it gives to Network Rail, because just like the Conservatives had proposed something called an integrated rail body that would be licensed to, in effect, become Great British Railways, but the licensed body would be Network Rail Infrastructure Limited, which would then sort of change the labels on the stationery and the plaques on the doors. This document also envisages that to avoid delay resulting from highly complex transfers of assets, people, and contracts that would otherwise be required during implementation, GBR, Great British Railways, will be created out of Network Rail Infrastructure Limited. So that's a it's kind of buried in that verbiage, Christian, but that's a very, very significant announcement, and somewhat contrary to what the previous Secretary of State was talking about when Louise Haig talked about the abolition of Network Rail. This is the evolution of Network Rail into a different entity.
Well, is it, Mark? I mean, because one could argue that, well, they're doing this for you could say that they're doing it for the reasons they've just explained, that legally it would be difficult to transfer. And I do remember conversations in the past with Peter Hendy, even before he was rail minister, kind of saying, oh, you don't want to choopy over kind of, however many people, 60, 80,000 people, you TUPE being the kind of transfer of undertakings, which means that you take over the staff on the same terms and conditions. And you don't want to do that to a new organization. Network Rail is the only organization that would be able to accommodate this kind of massive change. So you could say they're doing it for that reason. But at the end of the day, the board of GBR, whoever that might be, will actually be in charge of it.
Yeah, but they're happy to TUPE, as you put it, other people, Christian. So they describe how some parts of the Department for Transport, essentially civil servants, will be put into the Great British Railways organisation. And of course, that will require transfer of undertakings. So they're happy to do this when it suits them, but they have accepted this idea that that Network Rail should be the heart of GBR.
The top of the tree, at the top of the tree.
Yes, indeed. Now, there's a certain logic to that. I would accept that, but there probably is in fact less suggestion in this document than in earlier Conservative briefings that Network Rail will be subject to a kind of cultural change as part of this process. And there are many people in the rail industry, both from the kind of user's perspective, but also the supply chain, who worry about a sort of unreformed Network Rail with its kind of not invented here culture carrying on and in fact becoming even more dominant in the rail industry and possibly losing focus on the things that it's supposed to have as its primary responsibility, which of course is the delivery of engineering excellence and the provision of the capacity and the systems that the rest of the operating side of the industry needs to use. So I would expect that that will be quite a strong focus of the consultation responses, is other industry parties looking to secure guarantees about the way that GBR will behave if it's based around Network Rail Infrastructure Limited.
Well,
but there's lots more. There's lots more.
Yeah, well, just a couple of quick points on that to end that. Just a couple of quick points. One is Network Rail long ago abandoned the delivering engineering excellence kind of a subtitle that they had. That was something that they realized didn't sit very pretty with some of their performance. And secondly, it must be said that Network Rail has not performed wonderfully well recently, and so to put it, even parts of Network Rail will accept this, and managers, certainly of the train operators, but even some of Network Rail managers will accept that everything is overpriced. There's been more problems on the railways than before, and so on and so on. So, yes, this is one that I suspect will be up for consultation, and there'll be a lot of counter arguments. So what else is it?
But there's loads of other interesting content, though, as you say, it is rather a wordy document. And perhaps that wordiness might explain some of the curious way in which it was published, because strangely, there was a press release very early in the morning of the publication day. And then the consultation document itself didn't come out until later in the day, which suggests maybe there were some last minute revisions going on. But the one of the areas that the press release concentrated on was the establishment of a new voice for passengers, a new passenger watchdog, and lots of sort of consumer protection powers. But the document goes on about this at some length. But then when you read into the detail, they may well end up using transport focus as the basis for the new passenger watchdog, which is, of
Well,
course,
they
is a very
explicitly suggest they actually
yeah,
explicitly suggest
it
that, don't
actually
they? Yeah.
says that, and
Yeah.
so it says there is potential for the new watchdog to be built from the existing passenger watchdog, Transport Focus, which would be given increased powers, enabling it to become a strong advocate for better passenger experience. So it's sort of, in a way, I'm slightly puzzled as to what's the big deal about the new passenger watchdog, and clearly there's some political spin has been around that, trying to pick up on the idea that rail users are very dissatisfied with the service, and that the watchdog is going to be part of a process of improving
Right.
the quality of
There's
service.
also a lot of stuff about ticketing, isn't there?
There is talk about how the government proposes to integrate all of the ticketing platforms of the existing train operating companies under a GBR platform, but still allow all the sort of flowers in the forest to bloom by the enabling the independent ticket retailers to carry on. So the likes of the train line, Uber, and so on, to continue to function and offer some sort of competitive environment to the GBR system. Though, of course, one would imagine that the GBR ticketing system is going to be such a big beast that how much competition there will genuinely be must be something that I'm sure those retailers will be concerned about.
Particularly if it's free, and the retailers, the private retailers, tend to charge an extra booking fee, don't they,
Yes, they
to
do.
make profit?
Though, of course, that's often the case already, and yet their customers seem happy to pay those
Yes.
fees, and sometimes for other benefits as well, because they receive sort of other kind of incentives and consumer related benefits, don't they, from using the
Yeah.
platform? I believe that's the case. Now, some of the other themes that are picked up in the document, which will be of interest to our listeners, are, of course, at its heart is the the kind of parallel process that I described earlier of returning the passenger transport, but the passenger operating franchisees, as they were, to public ownership, and integrating them with Network Rail into the GBR organisation. That's the absolute kind of flagship part of the government's policy,
Yeah.
which it believes will reduce the amount of interfaces between the different parts of the railway organisation, and thereby reduce costs and increase efficiency. So that's the kind of big political gamble from all of this, is that as a result of that process, passengers will see more reliable, better connected, more frequent services. And there are proposals in there, some quite detailed proposals on how GBR will be managed in order to facilitate that. So we'll see the end of the train operators paying access charges to Network Rail as it was, and the associated contracts and performance regime that existed hitherto. But there's also there are references, of course, to open access operators, which was an issue we discussed in the last episode of this podcast, and trying to work out just how enthusiastic the government really is about open access operators running to sort of fill the gaps in the market and to be in competition with the state operator, the dominant state operator. And I think in Transport Questions in the House of Commons just last week, Transport Secretary was sort of fairly kind of dismissive of the role of open access operators and the share of the market that they are responsible for. But I think this document is slightly more positive about how they might be facilitated and contribute to
But
the industry.
but they're going to have to pay track access charges.
They will. That's
so
right.
So
That's
it
right.
depends how what level you set the track access charges.
Indeed,
I mean, you could
indeed.
completely mess them about by charging them, some of the kind of maintenance expenses as well as the kind of operating expense, as it were. So, as I understand it, one more thing probably you're going to talk about that the role of the Office of Road and Rail is actually going to be diminished in all
It
this.
is in quite a number of respects that there you can't help but feel that throughout the document there's a tendency to see less of a role for the Office of Rail and Road in providing access to the network for these competing operators, more of the kind of directing mind, but also very importantly a reduced role for the ORR in determining the financial structure of the rail industry and the sort of ongoing plans for the financing of the industry. Very much more of an assertion, it seems to me, of the role of the Secretary of State, and thereby, of course, behind the Secretary of State for Transport lurks the Treasury and the desire to have a stronger control over the finances and the as currently are subsidies going into the rail industry. So I think that's an area that will draw quite considerable attention as well.
And also, of course, that OR will have much lesser role in determining what open access operators there will be, and that was very much, as I read the document, saying that it will be the Secretary of State deciding whether there should be open access operators, and it basically kind of determine that and tell the OR what to do,
That
rather
seems to
than the
be
other way
that
around.
seems to be the direction of travel. That's right.
Right.
Yeah. And of course that gets into tricky areas because open access operators are currently in the process of buying lots of new trains and helping to keep the train
We've discussed
factories
this, yes,
open.
yes, indeed.
So that's a sort of double-edged issue there.
No,
And then
you say,
finally,
yeah.
on this subject, Christian, which is I'm sure something we're going to return to over the course of 2025, there's a big section in the report on the consultation document on devolution, the relationships with the Scottish and Welsh governments and the increasingly the metro mayors, of which there will be many more in England through the government's parallel devolution proposals, and the kind of relationship that there will be with these devolved authorities, what say they'll be able to have over the kind of services that operate in their respective territories. So that's a big area as well.
There's a complicated organogram about this as well, with lots of colours and kind of different types of devolution and God knows well. So it's a very complicated little bit of the consultation paper, isn't it?
Yes, it is, and I think that's an area which has a long way to run. It was interesting that in the news release, the Department for Transport was keen to include some quotes from a couple of the metro mayors saying, this is great, this is a brilliant reform and we're really, really pleased to see it happening. But I think that might disguise that bit of tension underneath the surface there between the desire to want to run a single directing mind GBR organization and the desire to have this local control. And one other factor in a sense around that directing mind, of course, that we mustn't skip over is the role of freight in the rail industry. So there is going to be a kind of statutory obligation on GBR to develop and encourage the growth of rail freight, which I'm sure will be welcomed. But you come against this point again that GBR will have a certain level of conflict of interest because it will be the dominant passenger operator and will be seeking to have as much of that capacity as it can get hold of to run more frequent passenger services where the market dictates that that's a good idea. And of course, in many of those routes, that's where the freight operators will be trying to find the capacity as well. So who arbitrates in those kind of situations will be a cause of some controversy, I think, going forward.
Okay, so to conclude, a very good summary, Mark. Essentially, the what is Labour is often accused of being statist is certainly at the core of this. I mean, the government will have a much more direct, strong role via GBR and sometimes directly from the Secretary of State. Would it be right to conclude with that?
I think it is a fair observation, but there's different kinds of statism. So you could have a statism that is
Well, the
about
SWP version of the IMG version.
No, I would say slightly differently. I would say there's a statism which says the best way to grow the railway and make it more successful is with this greater preponderance of central government control. But there's another kind of statism which we have seen in the past, whereby having the state in control of the railways is the best way to cut the costs and actually
Right.
squeeze the pips. And I think there is a long way to go in working out how those two conflicting forms of state intervention are going to be reconciled.
Well, it will give us a lot to talk about in a lot of future podcasts. So the railway delivers one thing, as always, it delivers good old controversies to discuss.
Many of our cities and towns are increasingly seeing the use of what some people call disruptive technologies and different kinds of shared and innovative transport modes, such as car sharing, bike sharing, the arrival of e-scooters. There's an organisation called Collaborative Mobility UK, or CoMo, that is the organisation that's representing all of the people involved in that sector. It's actually a charity for the public benefit of shared transport and includes things such as car clubs as well. Christian has been talking to Richard Dilks, who's the chief executive of CoMo UK.
The spread of e-bikes and hire bikes and all sorts of new types of bikes has been quite a feature of certainly in London, but also in other towns and cities across the country, and has rather changed the role of cycling. Certainly, it's enabled people to cycle who didn't cycle before, and certainly the hire bikes have caused some controversy by being left in various places, sometimes blocking the way of payments and so on. And so, to discuss these issues, I thought it'd be a good idea to talk with Richard Dilks of CoMo, who has been long campaigning on the issue of shared use, cycles and the like, and has some strong views on the subject. So, Richard, welcome to Calling All Stations.
Thank you. Very good to be aboard, I guess I should say. Thank you.
Well, let's deal with what we're trying to do here. These are basically good things, getting more people cycling or whatever, but it has caused considerable controversy, not least a rather poor panorama program recently. Why do you think this is controversial?
Yeah, I'm basically agreeing with you that this is a good thing. and we've got reams of evidence as to why it's a good thing. It's a good thing in a direct set of ways. It's also got lots of indirect benefits that maybe we'll come on to get into that are really powerful. But I'm also agreeing that London in particular at the moment, and this is mostly a London problem in the UK context that we're just you're raising here. It is problematic. It's not how it should be, and that's true of quite a number of things. It's most obviously true of where the bikes are, and that's causing issues for non-users, which shouldn't be the case. No successful, sustainable transport system should be causing issues for people who aren't using it. It's causing issues for users. It's causing issues for authorities. It's causing issues for operators, not very surprisingly. So in essence, nobody's very happy on that front, which tells you that that's not right.
Right. So
you shouldn't
can
be
be done
making
about?
winners and losers, but if you've got no winners at all on that front, then something's really not right. So for sure, there's a pressing set of issues around this now, and I think it's good if we can hold that thought in our heads at the same time as understanding that this is a good thing, that the boom in provision and use that's gone on has actually seen massive uplifts in the number of people accessing this. And in particular, I think that's particularly important for people getting back on a bike altogether. Of all the indirect benefits, that's the one I point to immediately.
Is there evidence of that? You've got actual
Yeah,
evidence
so what
of
we
that?
track this every year through thousands of user survey responses, different users each year, and the latest year's results, which are end of 2023, because we're just about to refresh and publish again. But they're very consistent trends. Is 45% of people are cycling again for the first time in a year or more using bike share. So these figures are high, and they've consistently been high. So it's a fantastic recruiting sergeant to cycling more broadly, basically.
Right.
So it's got a lot of great impacts, but the way it goes at the moment is not right. It's a reflection ultimately of London's very messy local government setup. And because it's all done highway authority by highway authority, borough by borough, you've got 34, ultimately potentially 34 different ways of doing this across a
Right.
big area. Unsurprisingly, no other global city has organized itself this way. No one looks at London on this front and thinks, what a great model to copy. And London itself knows this. There's been efforts underway for years now with boroughs, London Council's TfL, to come up with some sort of pan-London approach to this. The government is now in theory going to legislate this year in the English devolution bill to license shared bike schemes, it's got its origins partly in this story. So it's not as if everyone's just asleep on it, but it's very difficult and intensive to manage day to day at the moment for all concerns.
What is that? What's the worst problem? What's the worst problematic aspect of this, do you think?
I mean, I think it'd be good. There's a top five or something like that, but I think the number one is parking. Is
Right.
just not enough space given over to put these things, and in
And how
particular
do you resolve that?
well, quite. So really, you need to be resolving that where possible in taking out, in my view, and I think this would be backed by evidence of the direct and indirect benefits we've got over the years. You take out space that is used for less sustainable transport in favour of sustainable transport. So you take out a private car parking space where you can, rather than taking out a chunk of footway, for example.
Right.
The trouble is one you'll be achingly familiar with, and we probably are. The car parking spaces pay in inverted commas. They generate revenue directly into the
Yeah.
highway authorities, and the footway doesn't. Of course, if you strip the footway out, the city ceases to work, so it does pay in a broad sense, but not in a showing up in your budget this year sense. And so that car parking revenue tail continues to wag the dog far too much. There's other factors as well about process. It's very clunky and difficult to get these changes made quite often. It is hard work for authorities to do it, etc. But not enough space, and not enough space in the right places is, I think, the number one problem area. But you've underlying that, you've got this patchwork quilt problem. So you've got operators contracting with authorities, but not in any coherent uniform way because they can't, neither side can. And so you've got different arrangements in different boroughs. That would be bad enough. But on top of that, you've then got different choices made by different boroughs and operators. So you can have boroughs where you can pick up but can't drop off. You can have boroughs where you can ride through, but boroughs where you can't ride through. You can, and I mean, if you imagine taking the tube or train or bus or taxi or private hire vehicle or indeed any other mode of transport in London being like this, it becomes a minor miracle in a way that anyone uses these things given the level of inconvenience thrown at you as a as a user.
Yes, because some of them are kind of controlled in such a way that they stop giving you electric power if you go over a borough boundary, don't they?
Correct,
Yeah,
because they don't have permission to ride
yeah,
through beyond that boundary, which is otherwise in everyone's life invisible, really, right? I
yes,
mean, yes, the name on the bins changes and so on, but in just
yeah,
the sort of direct day-to-day consumer sense, it's not a meaningful boundary, particularly for transport, which has long since learned, with Herbert Morrison and London Transport back in the day. And so, these integrative lessons were learned, and having the kind of late 19th, early 20th century model of a bus turning up 2 minutes before the competitors to scoop all the passengers up and all this kind of
yeah.
stuff. Eventually, it was understood probably wasn't the best way of doing it. But yeah, we have these boundary issues there very sharply, and you have very different attitudes in boroughs on parking arrangements. So some will be very positive and have defaults of giving up space to bike share parking, and usually that fits with giving up space to cycle parking more broadly as well, which I'd strongly favour. These sort of false divisions aren't a great idea. But some others at the other end of the spectrum, just will not give up car parking spaces at all for anything.
Right. I mean, another aspect of the problem, and I don't know how much this is just a London problem, but there are a lot of souped up electric bikes, which are not the ones for hire, which often, it is fair to say, it's delivery drivers use to go pretty fast. I mean, they're supposed to be controlled at 15 miles an hour, but they go much faster. They're not pedaling. And these are really sort of electric scooters that mask as bikes. And
Yeah.
that's another issue, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. I'm glad you say it's another issue because Panorama didn't really handle it in that way and ended up mashing together these
It did,
two. But
yes.
actually, we need to disentangle them and understand them, I think. So essentially, absolutely, we've seen basically the emergence of an undesignated vehicle class here over the last handful of years.
Yeah.
And first there were a few, it was a trickle, and now it's more like a flood. And no one's got a grip on this. They
And some
as
of
you
them
say,
built
they're
like
not.
tanks. I mean, they have little
Yeah,
wheels and they
they're,
charge
they're
about,
not.
and
They're
somebody's
not
going
the
to
high
get
bikes.
killed by one of these.
They're
And
not
yeah,
legal. They're not compliant to the current technical standards. Of course, they're not. Um, but what's anybody doing about it? And the answer is not much. So to me, there is a strong case here for government looking more broadly at all of this and thinking about what regulations do we need that we don't have, which, I mean, for e-kick scooters, which remain only temporarily legal and stuck in this sort of policy limbo where they're in
yes,
these
e-scooters just have a trial. There's some trials in certain areas, but the
That's right.
rest of them are illegal. But
That's right.
lots of people have bought e-scooters illegally and use them to buzz around. Again, often, they overtake me and I'm going 15 miles an hour on my bike and they go
Yep.
faster.
Yep. No, exactly. I mean, of course, they've bought them legally is one problem here.
Right,
It's just the use is illegal.
right.
And I think it's fair to say quite a number of people on them don't actually even know that. And quite a number of them do know that. But the outcome's the same. They're breaking the law. But there's the fundamental need here to get a grip of this whole area, I think, in policy regulatory terms and define what is and is not legal. And we have massive gaps and oddities there. So with e-bikes, it's pretty well settled. And you could say there's a case for having a look at updating that. Should we have a class that is above an e-bike, but below an electric moped or something like that? I think that's at least worthy of consideration. But if we're going to have that, we should have appropriate standards defined through appropriate testing regimes and all the standard way in which government approaches having a new vehicle class, which is quite a considered multi-step process, as you would hope, I think. But we don't have that. We just have this blank space and lots of stuff zooming about. E-kick scooters is different in a way because we don't have any legal standards for them at all outside the trials because, hey, they're illegal to use on the public highway. So why would we have standards for a thing that the law doesn't know exists? But that's ridiculous. We're the only country in the world now, more or less, that has that situation. And clearly, if this was just, if you and I just encountered a couple of enthusiasts for this stuff doing this on a private road somewhere, it'd be difficult to claim it was sort of burning issue. But the reality is you've got unknown numbers of these devices, and certainly in London and increasingly in other UK cities, it's a daily experience for hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of people to have something like this zoom past them. So the cat is out of the bag. And I think the only solution has to be a well-designed set of regs that go across what we've got now, have an eye to the future as well, and are then kept updated. And the last bit, enforcement. So now we have a huge challenge because we've got hundreds of thousands of unlawful things of various kinds knocking about. What do we do about that?
Well, that's yes. Well, I was just going to ask you that. I mean, how government will say, oh, it's a hassle, but it's a minor issue, and so on. Whereas I would argue that people are going to get killed by these things, and definitely they're going to get killed by these electric scooters going at 30 miles an hour. But government would say we're too busy to do this. They ridiculously, the Tory government did something about pedicabs, which is only a problem kind of in central London and not a problem anywhere else, and is not much of a problem anyway. But bothered to do legislation towards that, but hasn't addressed this issue at all. So what should happen next?
Yeah, I agree. There's an illogic there because if the case is actually quite similar to my mind with pedicabs, of course, detailed differences and so on. But just on the principles of it, you've got something there which it's worth recognizing with all these things. Of course, people are using these things for reasons. They're not just kind of gadding about for the heck of it. That might be a little bit of it, but most of it's good old standard reasons people move around, isn't it? So they're finding them useful, which we should try and see the positives of that, I think, of thinking, so we have actually got a much increased population of people here who want to be on two wheels. The
Right.
snag is we haven't found a legal way for them to do that that's safe for them and safe for everyone else. So there are the problems. But I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater and demonize everything on two wheels here, which I think becomes a bit of a danger and is to an extent where that panorama that you mentioned ended up. So I think we have to go back to much have just criticised previous government for illogic there. One thing they did have roughly in the right direction, I think, was Future of Transport Bill, which is 2022, died a death. It was in the Queen's speech, but never made it to actually being brought forward. But that had a better, broader approach. So I'm not saying it was perfect, but that was trying to create a new vehicle class, low powered, zero emission vehicle, it was called LZEV. That's something on the right lines, I think. You've got to get into this new set of spaces, see what's what, see what you think is right for whatever reasons, establish that, have an enforcement regime around that. Critically, I think you've got to get into the retail side of this, because if you can define all you like, but if out on the open market you can buy all sorts and no one's going to stop you, and the police can't be expected to enforce this at the scale we're seeing out on the street, then the law becomes a nonsense, doesn't it? So you do all of that, and then crucially you keep it under review. And I think there's a ton of other stuff here that isn't perhaps so obvious that goes missing also. So there's and this all I've just been saying the last few minutes doesn't really directly impact the shared fleets because they're all legally compliant to established technical standards anyway. But of course, it does impact them because they're part of they're moving around in this ecosystem with these other devices, and certainly in people's perceptions, stuff has got terribly muddled up, and that's understandable. So, but where it does impact the shared fleets is in the future options. So there's lots of stuff the UK only has bits and bobs of that with a better approach here, it could have a lot more of. So, for example, cargo bike types or devices are useful for people who are wheelchair users but want some adaptations around those, or family-friendly bike options. And, all of this, I think, is well worth a look. Sustainable freight, a massive area of potential growth, and we're seeing some of it, but it doesn't have this clear-eyed view of what's in and outside the tent.
Is that because it lacks the legislation, it lacks the kind of regulations?
Yeah, it does. So I think my argument is we should make a virtue of the need for e-scooter legislation, which in the sense that we don't have any legal standards there. We can't get them without primary legislation. That seems to be the DFT's settled view. They've had a look at other options and they don't work. So therefore, we're going to have some primary legislation come through. So we should do this, in this broader way. The government, though, is doing this licensing of shared bikes and e-bike schemes, which is a more narrow approach to things. It is also, of course, doing product safety bill, so it's recognising the issues there around the battery side of things. But I fear we're coming at the problem, from this angle and that angle, but we're not looking at the whole thing.
Rather than what you're saying is we need an approach whereby we accept that this is a good thing and that we should be encouraging it, but it requires kind of the right sort of regulation and and you're saying it needs primary legislation. Have you talked to DFT or government ministers about this at all?
Oh yeah, endlessly, and plenty of other stakeholders. They're well aware of the points, and they do. To be fair to them, say on e-scooter legislation, this newish government, has said multiple times it does want to do it. So it's not as if they're in a position of they've just said no, go away. That's it's nice to have the intent, but of course what we need is the bill being introduced, which won't be in this parliamentary session. So it's a question of what comes in the next one, if anything.
Okay. Lastly, then, is there any country that does this right, and is there stuff to learn from abroad?
Yeah, clearly nowhere does it perfect, of course, but there definitely is a lot to learn from abroad, and we've just actually the survey on this licensing approach on bike share closed last week, and one of the points we made in our response to that was an offer to DFT of engaging on exactly this point of how do other jurisdictions that have gone further and faster manage this, and what have been their successes, and obviously what have been their failures. What would they not repeat or do differently or anything like that. It's a late mover advantage point if it's seized on for the UK, basically.
Okay, well, Richard, thank you very much for that. That's very informative, and we've learned a lot.
Here's Christian's final thought from the Departure Lounge.
Well, it really is from the Departure Lounge because I've been flying around again and I've been in departure lounges. And this time I flew to Kolkata with Emirates via Dubai. And there's the good and the bad about this because the flight itself, or both flights, were actually great, particularly the first flight in an A380 aircraft, which is capable of getting off the ground despite being able to carry up to 800 people. It actually usually carries about 550 because it's configured that way. But that's quite extraordinary experience that they can actually do that. And it's very comfortable. The food's not bad at all. There was absolutely amazing choice of films to watch. So that's all a great experience. The problem is I had to spend 6 hours in Dubai airport in the middle. And that really is pretty depressing because it's one of those ersatz places that could be anywhere in the world. So you can get, mozzarella paninis, and you can get hot dogs, and, you can get some Chinese food and whatever. And in a way that's wonderful, but in a way it's kind of absolutely nothing to do with the local culture. And it seems, you're really in this bubble of being in this kind of international place, which is very busy, but is completely soulless. But so, it wouldn't put me off flying by the same airline, but it is just, if you can at all avoid it, anything more than an hour and a half in Dubai airport is a bit of a nightmare.
Calling All Stations, the Transport podcast with Christian Walmart, is produced by Cogitamus Limited, a leading provider of public affairs consultancy services in the sector. We hope you've enjoyed this episode. If you have, please consider giving us a 5-star rating with whichever platform you use. Do follow us on social media channels, including Blue Sky, Facebook, and X, formerly known as Twitter. Our handle on X is @AllStationsPod.